The morning light came through the trees like something holy. It fell in long golden shafts through the canopy, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the October air, turning the forest floor into a cathedral of shadow and shine. The oaks had begun their slow surrender to autumn, their leaves burning in shades of copper and rust and deep arterial red, and the whole world smelled of wet earth and pine needles and the sweet decay of things letting go. Willa Crawford walked through it all like she owned every inch of it. She was 7 years old, small for her age with tangled brown hair that never stayed in its braids and skinned knees that her mother had long since stopped worrying about. Her backpack faded pink with a broken zipper on the front pocket bounced against her narrow shoulders with each step. Inside it, she carried the essentials: a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a water bottle with a unicorn sticker peeling at the edges, 3 Ziploc bags for collecting things, a magnifying glass she had found at a yard sale last summer and carried everywhere since as if the world might reveal its secrets if she just looked close enough. The woods behind her house in Cedar Hollow, Virginia were her kingdom. She knew them the way other children knew their bedrooms. Every fallen log was a landmark. Every moss-covered rock was a signpost. The creek that ran along the eastern ridge was her highway, and the old deer trail that wound up through the hickory grove was her shortcut to the high meadow where the butterflies gathered in late summer. She had names for certain trees. The twins' 2 poplars that grew so close together, their trunks had fused at the base. Old Grandfather, a massive chestnut oak at the top of the ridge that she swore was the oldest living thing in Virginia. The Whisperer, a willow by the creek whose branches made sounds like quiet conversation when the wind blew through them. Her mother always worried when she went into the woods alone, but Jolene Crawford worried about most things. She worried about money and the electric bill and whether the truck would pass inspection. She worried about the roof and the property taxes and the fact that Willa's father had been gone for 4 years now and showed no signs of ever coming back. Worry was the air Jolene breathed, the water she swam in, and Willa had learned early that the best way to handle her mother's worry was to simply not add to it. So she never told Jolene about the deeper parts of the forest, about the places where the trail disappeared and the trees grew so thick that the light went gray and soft, about the ravine where she had once found a fox skull clean and white and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, about the feeling she got sometimes deep in the old growth that the forest was watching her with something like affection. She was heading for the high meadow that Monday morning. It was early October and the last of the monarch butterflies would be passing through on their long migration south. She wanted to see them one more time before they were gone. The path took her past the creek through the hickory grove and then up a gentle slope where the trees thinned and the sky opened up. But today something was different. She noticed it first as a flash of light, a quick, sharp glint through the trees to her left, like sunlight catching glass or metal. She stopped walking and turned her head, squinting through the undergrowth. The light came again, a brief spark in the shadows, and then was gone. Willa was not a fearful child. Fear requires imagination of a certain kind, the ability to project forward into terrible possibilities, and Willa's imagination ran in different directions entirely. Where other children saw monsters in dark closets, Willa saw adventures waiting to happen. Where other children heard danger and strange sounds, Willa heard mysteries begging to be solved. So she left the trail. She pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel, the waxy leaves brushing against her arms, and ducked under a low-hanging branch of sourwood. The ground sloped downward here into a small hollow she had never explored before, a natural depression in the forest floor surrounded by old-growth oaks, whose roots broke through the earth like the knuckles of buried giants. And that is when she saw him. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Even sitting down slumped against the trunk of the biggest oak tree Willa had ever seen, he seemed to take up more space than any single person should. His shoulders were as wide as a door frame, and his arms, even in their current state of exhaustion, looked like they could bend iron. He wore a leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, both caked with dirt and dried sweat. His jeans were torn at the knees, and his boots, heavy black things with steel buckles, were scuffed down to bare leather. His beard was long and matted, threaded with gray and tangled with small leaves and bits of twig. His hair, dark and streaked with silver, hung past his shoulders in thick, unwashed ropes. Tattoos covered every visible inch of his arms. Dragons and skulls and flames and words and scripts Willa could not read. They ran up past his wrists and disappeared under his sleeves, and she could see the edges of more ink creeping up the sides of his neck. But it was not the tattoos or the size of him or even the leather vest with its patches and pins that made Willa stop breathing for a moment. It was the chains. Heavy steel chains were wrapped around his wrists and looped around the trunk of the oak tree behind him. They were secured with a padlock the size of Willa's fist, the metal dull and scratched from what looked like hours of futile struggle. The chains had bitten into his skin, leaving raw red grooves that wept small beads of blood where they pressed tightest. His hands, massive and covered in faded tattoos, hung limp in his lap, the fingers slightly curled as if they had given up reaching for anything. And there was something else, something that Willa noticed only because she was closer now, close enough to see the details that distance had hidden. On the left side of his flannel shirt, just below the ribs, the fabric was stiff and dark with something that was not dirt. It was blood, a large dried stain that spread from a point just above his hip and soaked downward through the fabric old enough to have turned from red to a deep, ugly brown. He had been hurt there, hurt badly before the chains, before the tree, before any of this. Someone had done something to his side that had bled through his clothes and dried in the open air, and no one had treated it, and he had been sitting here with it for days. And he was crying, not the way Willa's mother cried sometimes at night when she thought Willa was asleep. Not the quiet, stifled crying of someone trying to hold it together. This was something deeper, something that came from a place below tears. His shoulders trembled with it, and his breath came in ragged, broken gasps, and his whole body seemed to shake with the effort of containing whatever was breaking apart inside him. In his chained hands, clutched against his chest like something precious and fragile, was a piece of paper, an envelope crumpled and stained with dirt and what might have been blood. He held it the way a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood, as if letting go of it would mean the end of everything. Willa stood at the edge of the hollow, one hand still gripping a branch of mountain laurel, and watched this enormous, terrifying, weeping man. She should have been afraid. Every lesson her mother had ever taught her, every warning about strangers and danger and the things that could happen to little girls in the woods, should have sent her running back up the slope and down the trail and home to the safety of the kitchen table. But Willa did not run, because she had noticed something that changed everything. Something that rewired the entire picture in front of her the way a single word can change the meaning of a sentence. His eyes. Through the mess of his beard and the wild tangle of his hair, through the tattoos and the dirt and the fearsome bulk of him, his eyes were the saddest things Willa had ever seen. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held in them a pain so deep and so raw that it made Willa's own eyes sting just to look at them. They were not the eyes of a monster. They were not the eyes of a dangerous man or a criminal or any of the things that the adults in her life would later call him. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything and knew it. A twig snapped under Willa's foot. The man's head jerked up. His body went rigid, the chains snapping taut as his arms instinctively tried to move into a defensive position. The movement made him wince hard, his jaw clenching and his breath catching in a way that told Willa the wound on his side was still very much alive. For a moment, raw fear crossed his face, the kind of fear that belongs to a hunted animal. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the trees before landing on Willa. They stared at each other. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. A blue jay called out somewhere in the canopy above its sharp cry, the only sound in a world that had gone suddenly still. The morning light fell between them in a single shaft, catching the dust motes that hung in the air like tiny planets. Then Willa did something remarkable. She sat down. Right there at the edge of the hollow, she lowered herself to the ground and set her backpack in her lap. She did it the way she did everything. Naturally, without performance, as if sitting down in front of chained strangers in the forest was simply what one did on a Monday morning in October. The man's rigid posture softened by a fraction. His eyebrows, thick and dark under his wild hair, drew together in confusion. He had clearly expected many things. A scream, a panicked retreat, the sound of small feet running away through the leaves. He had not expected this small person to simply sit down and look at him with calm, curious eyes. "Why are you crying, mister?" Her voice came out clear and steady, the way children's voices do when they are asking genuine questions without pretense or agenda, just pure need to understand. The man blinked. His mouth opened and closed. The chains clinked softly as his hands shifted in his lap, instinctively trying to hide the crumpled envelope. "You need to go." His voice was raw and rough, like gravel scraping against concrete. It was the voice of a man who had spent days without water, days without speaking, days with nothing but his own thoughts for company. Despite its roughness, there was something in it that Willa caught immediately. A gentleness buried under all that gravel. A carefulness in the way he spoke to her as if she were made of something breakable. These woods are not safe for a kid like you. Willa tilted her head the way she did when her teacher said something that did not make sense. The woods are my favorite place, she said. I come here every day. What happened to your hands? She was looking at the chains, at the raw, angry welts they had left on his wrists. She had seen marks like that once before on a dog that Mr. Henderson down the road had kept tied up too short on a chain-link run. The dog had rubbed its neck bloody trying to get free. Willa had cried about that dog for a whole week until her mother finally called animal control. This was the same thing. She knew it in the same deep, wordless way that she knew the difference between a sound that meant danger and a sound that meant the world was just going about its business. Someone had tied this man up and left him here. The man looked down at his wrist as if noticing the damage for the first time. He flexed his fingers, slowly wincing at the movement. Look, kid. He tried to make his voice hard, tried to put an edge on it that would scare her away. You do not want to be here. The people who did this, they are not nice people. And if they come back and find you here, it will be bad. Real bad. So you need to turn around and go home and forget you ever saw me. Can you do that? Willa considered this for a moment. She looked at the chains, then at the envelope he was clutching, then at the dark stain on his side, then back at his face. His eyes were watching her with a mixture of desperation and something else. Something that looked an awful lot like hope. The kind of hope that a person tries very hard to kill because hoping hurts too much when you have been disappointed too many times. What is that letter, she asked. The man's jaw tightened. His fingers curled protectively around the envelope. It is nothing. It does not look like nothing. It looks important. You are holding it like my mama holds her picture of daddy. Something cracked in the man's face. The hard set of his jaw trembled and his eyes went glassy, and for a moment Willa thought he was going to start crying again. But he pulled it back, swallowed it down. The effort it took was visible in the cords of his neck and the white of his knuckles around the paper. It is a letter, he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. For someone I have never met. Someone I should have been there for, but was not. Who is it for? The man closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. The wall he had been trying to build between himself and this small, relentless girl had developed a crack, and through that crack, truth leaked out. My daughter, he said. I have a daughter, 8 years old. I did not even know she existed until 6 months ago. He looked at the envelope in his hands. I was going to find her. That is why I left. That is why they did this. Willa was quiet for a long time. She looked at the chains and she looked at the letter, and she looked at the face of this man who was big enough to be frightening and broken enough to be safe, and she made a decision that would change the course of her life and the life of everyone in Cedar Hollow. She unzipped her backpack. She pulled out the peanut butter sandwich still wrapped in wax paper and the water bottle with the peeling unicorn sticker. She placed them carefully on the ground in front of him, just close enough for his chained hands to reach. My name is Willa, she said. What is yours? The man stared at the sandwich, at the water bottle, at this impossible child who sat before him without a trace of fear, offering her lunch to a chained stranger as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Bear, he said. People call me Bear. Willa nodded as if this made perfect sense. Eat your sandwich, Mr. Bear, she said. I will figure out the rest. Bear's trembling hands reached for the water bottle first. The chains clinked and scraped against the tree bark as he moved, and Willa watched as his massive, tattooed fingers dwarfed the small container. He drank slowly, carefully, the way someone drinks who has not had water in a long time and knows that drinking too fast will make you sick. Then he unwrapped the sandwich. He took a small bite and chewed with his eyes closed, and Willa saw a single tear track down through the dirt on his cheek and disappear into his beard. He did not wipe it away. He just sat there chewing peanut butter and jelly, crying silently, and Willa sat across from him and let him have that moment without commentary or judgment. When he finished, she stood up and brushed the leaves from her pants. Her face had set into an expression that Jolene would have recognized immediately. The expression that meant Willa Crawford had made up her mind about something, and God help anyone who tried to change it. I have to go now, she said, but I am coming back tomorrow. I will bring more food and something for those cuts on your hands. Bear shook his head. No, little girl, you cannot come back here. Promise me you will not come back. My mama says helping people is always the right thing to do. Willa said, her voice firm and unwavering. Even when it is scary. Before Bear could argue further, she turned and began walking back up the slope, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. Bear called after her, his chains rattling as he tried to sit forward, but Willa was already gone, swallowed by the laurel thicket, her small footsteps fading into the rustle of leaves. Bear leaned back against the oak tree and looked down at the crumpled letter in his hands. For the first time in 5 days since the moment Colt and the others had driven him into these woods and beaten him and wrapped those chains around him and left him here to die slowly of thirst and exposure, for the first time since all of that, something shifted in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too strong a word for what he felt. But something adjacent to hope. Something in the neighborhood. A 7-year-old girl had just shared her lunch with him and promised to come back. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 20 years. The screen door slammed behind Willa like a gunshot. Jolene was at the kitchen sink washing dishes from that morning's breakfast, her hands red from the hot water and her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was 32 years old, but looked older, the way single mothers in small Appalachian towns often do, worn smooth by work and worry the way river stones are worn smooth by current. Her face was pretty in a tired way, with high cheekbones and pale blue eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, running the numbers on a problem that never quite balanced out. "Mama!" Willa burst into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed from running leaves tangled in her hair. "Mama, I found someone who needs our help." Jolene glanced up from the sink, a familiar half-smile forming on her lips. "Another injured bird baby." "No, Mama. I found a man in the woods." The dish Jolene was holding slipped from her fingers and clattered into the sink. The sound was sharp and wrong in the warm kitchen air. Jolene's hands gripped the edge of the counter, and the color drained from her face in a way that Willa had never seen before. "What did you say?" "He is really big." Willa continued, oblivious to the transformation happening on her mother's face. "With lots of pictures on his arms. And he has a long beard with leaves in it. But Mama, he is tied up with chains. Someone chained him to a tree. And he was crying. He was holding a letter for his little girl. And Mama, he is hurt on his side. There is blood on his shirt. A lot of blood. Ahanad." Jolene moved fast. She crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and dropped to her knees in front of Willa, gripping her daughter's shoulders with wet, trembling hands. "Where?" Jolene's voice was barely a whisper. "Where exactly did you find this man?" "In the hollow past the hickory grove. Past old grandfather. You go down the slope where the laurel gets thick, and there is a dip in the ground with really big oaks, and he is chained to the biggest one." Jolene pulled Willa into a hug so tight it squeezed the breath out of her. Willa could feel her mother's heart hammering through her chest, a rapid, desperate drumbeat that spoke of every fear a mother has ever known. "Oh, baby." Jolene's voice cracked. "Oh, Willa, you cannot go back there. You promise me right now that you will never go back to those woods. Do you hear me? Never." "But Mama," Willa squirmed in the embrace. "He needs help. He is hurt and thirsty, and he has not eaten in days. And he has a letter for his daughter that he has never even met. We have to help him." Jolene pulled back and held Willa at arm's length. Her face had transformed. The worry that usually lived in her eyes like a low-grade fever had flared into something hotter. Something hard and fierce and absolute. "Listen to me very carefully, Willa. That man is dangerous. Good people do not end up chained to trees in the woods. Bad people do bad things and end up in bad situations because of the choices they have made. That is how the world works." "But he wants to be good now," Willa protested, her lower lip trembling. "He told me. He said he wanted to find his daughter. He said that is why the bad people hurt him, because he wanted to leave. Sometimes bad people say things they do not mean." Jolene's voice softened, but her grip on Willa's shoulders did not loosen. They lie to get what they want. That is why we do not talk to strangers, especially strangers who are chained up in the woods. He was not lying, Mama. Willa's voice rose with a child's conviction. You did not see his eyes. They were kind eyes, sad eyes, like yours get sometimes when you think I am asleep. The words landed like a slap. Jolene flinched, and for a moment her stern expression wavered, but she recovered quickly. "This is not up for discussion." Jolene stood up, running her hands through her hair. "You are not to go back to those woods. You are not to tell anyone else about this man. Do you understand me?" "But Mama, he will die out there. He has not had water or food in days, and his hands are bleeding from the chains, and he is hurt on his side, and if nobody helps him, he will just..." Jolene's hand came up, palm out. Willa fell silent, but her jaw was set, and her small hands had balled into fists at her sides, and the fire in her eyes was not going anywhere. Promise me, Jolene said. Right now. Promise me you will stay away from him. Willa stared at the floor for a long moment. Then she looked up at her mother with eyes that were too old for her face. I promise, Mama, she said quietly. Behind her back, her fingers were crossed. News traveled through Cedar Hollow the way it always had. Not through newspapers or television or the internet, though all of those things existed, but through the older and more reliable network of human voices passing information across kitchen tables and diner counters, and the wooden bench outside Thompson's Hardware, where the retired men gathered every morning with their coffee cups and their opinions. By Tuesday afternoon, the story had spread to every corner of the town. It started at Nell's Diner, where Brenda Hawkins mentioned to the breakfast crowd that Jolene Crawford had come into the pharmacy looking pale as a ghost and asking strange questions about first aid supplies. From there, it jumped to the hardware store where old Dub Patterson told the bench crew that his nephew, who lived on Cedar Ridge, had heard strange sounds coming from the deep woods 2 nights ago. Chains rattling. A man's voice calling out. Then little Tommy Parker mentioned at recess that Willa Crawford had found something in the forest, something scary and big. And by the time that whisper made it from the playground to the pickup line, it had grown teeth and tattoos and a criminal record. By Wednesday, the story had found its final, most dramatic form the way stories always do when they pass through enough mouths. A little girl found a Hell's Angel chained to a tree in the woods. The words ripped through Cedar Hollow like a cold wind. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were bolted shut. Parents who had let their children roam freely suddenly kept them indoors watching from windows with drawn curtains. The easy, unhurried rhythm of the town stuttered and broke. At the elementary school, children whispered during recess. Was he really big as a bear? Did he have tattoos on his face? Did Willa touch the chains? Teachers intercepted notes passed during math class, small folded pieces of paper covered in breathless questions about the monster in the woods. Willa said nothing. She sat at her desk and traced patterns in the margin of her notebook and thought about a pair of sad eyes and a crumpled letter held in chained hands. On Wednesday evening, Sheriff Harlan called a meeting at the town hall. The wooden benches filled quickly. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place where a town meeting was both civic duty and social event, and the combination of genuine fear and hungry curiosity packed the hall to standing room only. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh institutional glow that made people look older and more worried than they actually were. Sheriff Cole Harlan stood at the front of the room. He was 60 years old with a face like a leather wallet and a body that had once been powerful but had settled into the thick, deliberate solidity of a man who had spent decades carrying authority. His hair was steel gray and cut short, and his eyes sharp and pale blue moved across the crowd with the practiced assessment of a man who was used to reading rooms. He had been sheriff of Cedar Hollow for 23 years. In that time, he had dealt with drunk drivers and domestic disputes and the occasional methamphetamine lab out in the hollows. He had once talked a man down from the water tower with nothing but patience and a thermos of coffee. He was by any reasonable measure a good lawman. But there was a crack in Sheriff Harlan that ran deeper than anyone knew. Now I understand everyone is concerned about this situation. He began, his deep voice commanding the room. We have confirmed that there is indeed an individual in those woods. Based on the description we have received and based on some inquiries I have made with state law enforcement, we believe this individual is a member of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. The gas that moved through the room was collective and sharp, like a single breath drawn by 50 people at once. Harlan held up his hands for silence. I want to be clear about what we are dealing with here. These are not weekend bikers or hobbyists. The Hells Angels are a criminal organization involved in activities that I will not detail in mixed company. They are dangerous, and anyone who has contact with this individual is putting themselves and their family at risk. He paused, letting the words settle. I am telling you this straight. If you see anything suspicious in or near those woods, anything at all, you come to me. We will handle this. We cannot afford to have this element in our community. Sometimes keeping people safe means doing what has to be done. His eyes moved to the group of men in the front rows. Farmers and mechanics and construction workers. Men with hard hands and harder opinions about how to protect their homes. They nodded grimly, understanding the implication in the sheriff's words. In the third row, Jolene sat with her arm around Willow, who had insisted on coming despite her mother's objections. Willa watched the sheriff's face as he spoke, and something cold settled in her stomach. He was talking about Bear the way people talked about rabid animals, as a problem to be eliminated. But she knew something nobody else in that room knew. She knew that the problem had sad eyes and trembling hands and a letter for a daughter he had never met. And the distance between what she knew and what the room believed felt like a canyon opening up beneath her feet. Later that night, the town hall was dark and empty. Sheriff Harlan sat alone in his office at the back of the building, the only light coming from the green-shaded desk lamp that had been there since before he took the job. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he kept locked with a small brass key he wore in his keyring. Inside, beneath a stack of old case files and a bottle of bourbon he pretended he did not keep, there was a shoebox. He lifted it out and set it on the desk. Inside the shoebox were letters, 27 of them, each in the same envelope, each addressed in the same cramped, desperate handwriting. They were from his brother Levi. Levi Harlan had been 3 years younger than Cole. Where Cole had been steady and responsible, Levi had been wild. Where Cole had followed their father into law enforcement, and Levi had followed every bad impulse he ever had, straight into a series of increasingly serious mistakes. Drugs first, then theft, then running with people who made theft look like a hobby. Cole had tried to help. For years he had tried, he had bailed Levi out, he had found him jobs. He had sat across from him at kitchen tables and in visiting rooms and on the bench outside the courthouse and had said the same thing over and over. You have to change, Levi. You have to want to be different. And Levi had always nodded, had always agreed, had always made promises that dissolved like sugar in rain the moment the pressure let up. Until finally, after the third arrest, after the conviction, after the judge's gavel came down, and Levi was led away in handcuffs, Cole had made a decision. He stopped going to the prison. He stopped taking the calls. He stopped reading the letters. He told himself it was for the best, that he had done everything he could, and that some people simply could not be saved. That cutting Levi off was an act of self-preservation, not cruelty. Levi died in his cell 18 months later. Heart failure, the prison doctor said. But Cole knew better. Levi had died of something the doctor could not put in a chart. He had died of being alone, of being abandoned by the one person in the world who was supposed to love him no matter what. The last letter had arrived 2 weeks before Levi died. Cole had not opened it until the day of the funeral, sitting in his truck in the cemetery parking lot with the engine running and his hands shaking so badly he could barely tear the envelope. The letter was short. Cole, I know you gave up on me. I understand why. But I want you to know I am trying. I am really trying this time. I just need one person to believe I can change. Just one person to give me a chance. If that person cannot be you, then I guess it cannot be anyone. I love you, brother. I am sorry for everything. Levi. Cole Harlan had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. The creases were deep enough to have worn through in places, and the ink had smudged from the moisture of his hands. He read it again now in the green light of his desk lamp and felt the same thing he always felt. Shame. A vast, bottomless, all-consuming shame that lived in his chest like a second heart, pumping poison through his veins with every beat. And now there was a man in the woods, a man who had been part of a gang, a man who by all accounts was trying to leave that life behind, a man who had been punished for wanting to change. Cole set the letter down and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon. He drank it in one swallow and felt the burn travel down his throat and settle in his stomach. He did not hate Bear because Bear was dangerous. He hated Bear because Bear was Levi. Because every time someone mentioned the man in the woods, every time they described his chains and his tattoos and his apparent desire to be something different than what he had been, Cole heard his brother's voice in his head. I just need one person to believe I can change. And the only way to silence that voice was to make the man in the woods go away. Cole locked the shoebox back in the drawer and turned off the lamp. He sat in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of his badge on his chest like an anchor pulling him down into water he could not see the bottom of. Thursday morning, before dawn, Willa moved through the house like a ghost. She had learned over the past 4 years of living with a mother who slept lightly and worried deeply how to move without making a sound, which floorboards creaked and which ones did not, how to open the refrigerator without the seal making that sucking noise, how to ease the back door open 1 millimeter at a time until the gap was wide enough for her narrow body to slip through. Her backpack was heavier today. She had packed 2 sandwiches instead of 1, plus an apple and a handful of granola bars she had taken from the pantry one at a time over the past 2 days, so the box would not look suddenly emptied. She had also taken the small first aid kit from under the bathroom sink. The forest was different in the dark. The familiar landmarks were hidden in shadow, and the sounds were different. The daytime chorus of birds and insects was replaced by a deeper, older silence, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant rustling of something moving through the underbrush. But Willa was not afraid. The forest was her friend in daylight, and she chose to believe it was still her friend in the dark. By the time she reached the hollow, the sky had begun to lighten from black to deep blue, and the first birds were testing their voices in the canopy above. Bear was still there. Of course he was. Where would he go? But he looked worse. Even in the dim light, she could see that his head was hanging lower than before, his shoulders more deeply slumped. The stain on his side had spread, she thought, though it was hard to tell in the half-light. His breathing had a wet, rattling quality that she did not like. "Mr. Bear," she called softly. His head came up slowly. It took longer this time, as if the simple act of lifting his chin required an effort that was almost more than he could manage. His eyes found her in the growing light, and something happened to his face that Willa would remember for the rest of her life. He smiled. It was small and broken and exhausted, but it was there. A real smile from a man who had clearly forgotten what smiling felt like. It changed his whole face. For just a moment, Willa could see the person he must have been before everything went wrong. "Little girl," he said. His voice was weaker than yesterday, rougher, more frayed at the edges. "I told you not to come back." "I know," Willa said, settling onto the ground and opening her backpack. "But I do not always do what people tell me. Mama says that is my most frustrating quality." She pulled out the sandwiches and the water bottle and set them in front of him. Then she opened the first aid kit and studied its contents with the serious expression of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "I am going to clean your wrist now," she announced. "It might sting a little bit. My mama always says that when she puts the medicine on my scrapes, it always stings more than a little bit, but I think she says it so I will not be scared." Bear watched her with those dark, liquid eyes. "You should not be here," he said, but there was no force behind it. Willa tore open an antiseptic wipe and moved closer. Up close, the damage to his wrist was worse than she had thought. The metal had rubbed the skin raw in places, and the edges of the wounds were red and angry-looking. She began to clean them carefully, gently, and Bear flinched at the sting, but did not pull away. He sat very still while a 7-year-old girl tended to him. "What about your side?" Willa asked, glancing at the stain on his shirt. "That looks bad, too." Bear looked down. His hand moved to cover the wound, an automatic gesture of concealment. "It is nothing," he said, "just a scratch." "That is not a scratch, Mr. Bear. I have had scratches. That is something else." Bear was quiet for a moment. Then, because lying to this child felt like a sin against something sacred, he told the truth. "They used a knife," he said, "before the chains, to make sure I could not run even if I got free." Willa's face went very still. The antiseptic wipe paused in her hand. She looked at the wound on his side, and she looked at the chains on his wrists, and she understood, in the sudden, total way that children sometimes understand terrible things, that the people who had done this had intended for him to die here. The chains were not just a punishment. The knife wound was not just a warning. They had hurt him and bound him and left him in the woods to bleed and starve and disappear. And if Willa had not wandered off her trail that Monday morning, that is exactly what would have happened. "I am not big enough to fix that," she said, her voice smaller than before. "But I can put a bandage on the outside." Bear looked at this child who had just grasped the reality of his situation and was not running away, but instead reaching for the bandage box with steady hands. Something broke inside him, not the way things break when they are destroyed, but the way things break when they are finally being set free. "Tell me about your daughter," Willa said as she carefully applied a bandage to the least damaged part of his wrists. And he did. He told her that his daughter's name was Lily, that she was 8 years old, that she lived with her mother in Knoxville, Tennessee, that he had not even known she existed until 6 months ago, when a letter arrived from a woman he had known before the war, before everything, telling him that he had a child who had been asking about her father. "She is the same age as me," Willa said. "Almost." "Yeah," Bear whispered. "Yeah, she is. Is that why you left the bad people?" Bear nodded. "I was already thinking about it. Had been thinking about it for years. But the letter made it real. Made me realize that every day I spent with them was a day stolen from her." Willa finished with the bandages and sat back. "You will find her," she said with absolute certainty. "After we get you out of here, you will find her and give her that letter, and she will know that her daddy loves her." Bear reached out as far as the chains would allow and very gently touched the back of Willa's hand with his fingertips. "Thank you, Willa," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Willa visited Bear again on Friday, bringing more food and water and fresh bandages. She noticed that he was weaker each time despite the nourishment she brought. The wound on his side was the reason. She could see it in the careful way he held himself, the hitch in his breathing. When he shifted position, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, even in the cool morning air. The knife wound was doing its work from the inside, and no amount of peanut butter sandwiches could stop what was happening beneath the surface of his skin. He told her more about himself on that visit. His real name was Hank Maddox, but everyone had called him Bear since he was 19. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines, and he had come home to a country that did not know what to do with him. No job, no support, nightmares that turned every night into a battlefield. He told her about the drinking, which led to the fighting, which led to the arrest, which led to losing his apartment and his last remaining friend, and ending up sleeping under a highway overpass in Roanoke. And then the Hells Angels found him. They gave me what nobody else would. Bear said, his voice flat and distant, a place to sleep, food, people who did not look at me like I was broken. He paused. I did not realize until later that the price of belonging was becoming something I did not recognize. On that Friday afternoon, Willa was not alone. Opal Mackey had been watching Willa Crawford for 3 days. Opal was 70 years old. She had lived in Cedar Hollow her entire life, had married Thomas Mackey when she was 22, had run the general store on Main Street for 47 years, and had buried Thomas 6 years ago after a heart attack took him on the floor of the stockroom between the canned goods and the cleaning supplies. She had found him there, his face already gray, his hand still reaching for the bottle of bleach he had been trying to shelve. Since that day, Opal had become a closed door. She ran the store. She made small talk with customers when required. She attended church on Sundays because she had always attended church on Sundays. But the warmth that had once defined her had retreated behind a wall of efficient silence. She noticed things, though. That was the curse of a quiet person in a small town. And she had noticed Willa buying bandages and antiseptic wipes from her store with $3.47 in loose change. And she had noticed the girl's backpack sitting heavier than usual on her shoulders. And she had noticed the direction Willa walked when she left the store. So on Friday afternoon, Opal closed the store early. She put on her walking shoes and her old canvas jacket, and she followed Willa Crawford into the forest. She followed at a distance, watching Willa's pink backpack bob through the laurel and down the slope into the hollow. When Opal saw Bear for the first time, she stopped behind a thick oak trunk and pressed her hand against the bark to steady herself. Her heart was beating fast, but not with fear. With something else. Recognition. She watched as Willa sat down in front of this enormous chained, broken man and began to tend to him. She watched as the man accepted the child's help with trembling hands in a gentleness that contradicted everything his appearance suggested. And then Opal stepped out from behind the oak. Bear saw her first. His body went rigid, the chains snapping taut, his eyes wide with fear. But Opal held up her hands, palms out the way you approach a frightened horse. Easy, she said. Her voice was firm and dry, carrying no trace of either fear or sympathy. I am not here to cause trouble. Miss Opal. Willa's face lit up. Miss Opal, this is Mr. Bear. He needs help. I can see that. Opal walked down into the hollow studying Bear the way she studied merchandise when it came into the store. Assessing quality, checking for damage, determining value. Then she knelt beside him, set down the canvas bag she had brought, and began to unpack. Real bandages, antiseptic solution, clean cloths, a small blanket, a thermos of hot soup. How long, she asked, her hands already working on the wounds with a briskness and competence that came from decades of practical living. 5 days, Bear said. And that? She nodded toward the stain on his side. How deep? Deep enough. Bear's jaw tightened. They used a hunting knife. Wanted to make sure I stayed put even if I got loose. Opal lifted the edge of his shirt without asking permission. What she saw made her face tighten. The wound was angry and inflamed, the skin around it hot to the touch, the edges beginning to show the first signs of serious infection. This was not something that would heal on its own. This was something that was getting worse by the hour, working its poison inward even as the surface appeared to hold. This needs more than I can do here, Opal said, pulling his shirt back down. You need proper treatment, antibiotics, stitches. No doctors, Bear said. No hospitals. They will find me. Opal looked him dead in the eyes. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them. The understanding of two people who have both stared into the dark and know what lives there. I buried my husband 6 years ago, Opal said quietly. Thomas Mackey. Everyone in this town loved him. He died on the stockroom floor while I was out front selling someone a bag of flour. By the time I found him, he was already cold. Her hands paused for just a moment. I let that man die without ever telling him what he meant to me. Too proud, too stubborn, too busy being strong to ever let him see that I needed him. She tied off a bandage and moved to his other wrist. I will not stand by and watch someone else die alone when I could have done something. Not again. Bear looked at this old woman with her steady hands and her dry eyes. He looked at Willa, watching the two of them with an expression of pure radiant hope. "You are both going to get yourselves in trouble," he said. Probably Opal agreed without looking up from her work. Willa grinned. "That is okay, Mr. Bear. The best things always start with a little bit of trouble." The three of them sat together under the ancient oak tree as the October sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened. An old woman who had forgotten how to feel, a broken man who had forgotten how to hope, and a 7-year-old girl who had somehow become the strongest person in Cedar Hollow. The chain still held, the wound still hurt, the danger was still real. But something had changed. Something small and fragile and stubborn had taken root. Something that felt impossibly like the beginning of a family. And 2 miles away in his dark office, Sheriff Cole Harlan sat with his brother's letter in his hands and a decision growing in his chest. A decision about the man in the woods, about what needed to be done. He folded the letter and put it back in the shoebox and locked the drawer and told himself, as he had told himself 1,000 times before, that some people simply could not be saved. But his hands were shaking, and somewhere in a place he had walled off so long ago that he had forgotten it existed, a small voice whispered. "Just one person, Cole. That is all it takes." He turned off the light and went home to his empty house and lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Saturday morning came wrapped in fog. It rolled through Cedar Hollow like a living thing pouring down from the Blue Ridge in thick white rivers that filled the hollows and drowned the valleys and turned the familiar world into something strange and muffled. Trees appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The mountains were gone, entirely swallowed whole. Willa stood at her bedroom window and watched the fog move. She had not slept well. She had lain awake for hours thinking about Bear's face the previous afternoon, the sheen of sweat that would not go away, the hitch in his breathing that was getting worse, the way his hand had pressed against the wound on his side when he thought she was not looking, his fingers going white with the pressure, his jaw clenching against pain he was trying to hide. The knife wound was killing him. Slowly, from the inside out, the infection was spreading through his body like fire through dry wood. The food and water and bandages were keeping his surface alive, but underneath, where it mattered, something was failing. She could not let that happen. Willa got dressed in the dark. She put on her sturdiest shoes. She loaded her backpack with the last of the granola bars and a bottle of water and went downstairs. Jolene was still asleep. Willa paused outside her mother's door and pressed her palm flat against the wood. "I am sorry, Mama," she whispered, "but I have to." She slipped out the back door and disappeared into the fog. By the time she reached Opal's store on Main Street, the fog had begun to thin. The store was dark, but Willa knew that Opal rose before dawn. She knocked on the side door, 3 quick raps, then 2 slow ones. The door opened. Opal stood in the frame, already dressed, her silver hair pinned back in the tight bun she wore like armor. She looked down at Willa without surprise. "He is getting worse," Willa said. "I know. We have to move him. He needs a roof and warmth and real medicine. The cut on his side is making him sicker. We cannot keep him alive with sandwiches and bandages." Opal studied the child's face. The determination there was absolute. It was not the reckless bravery of someone who does not understand the consequences. It was the courage of someone who understands perfectly and chooses to act anyway. "I have bolt cutters in the stockroom," Opal said. They went into the woods together. The fog clung to the trees like cotton, muffling their footsteps. Opal carried the bolt cutters in a canvas duffel bag filled with blankets. Willa carried her backpack and a thermos of coffee that Opal had pressed into her hands at the last moment. When they reached the hollow, Bear was unconscious. His head had fallen forward, chin on chest, and his breathing was the worst Willa had ever heard it. A wet, labored sound that seemed to catch and stutter on every intake. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made Willa's stomach drop. The fever had arrived overnight, driven by the infection that was now coursing through his blood from the untreated knife wound. 5 days of exposure and starvation had left his body with nothing to fight it. Opal checked his pulse, felt his forehead lifted one of his eyelids. Her face remained expressionless, but Willa caught the slight tightening around her eyes that meant the news was not good. The wound on his side has gone septic, Opal said. Fever is high. We do this now, or we do not do it at all. She positioned the bolt cutters on the padlock that held the chains together. The tool was old, but the blades were sharp, and Opal had the kind of grip strength that comes from decades of hauling inventory and wrestling with stubborn jar lids. She squeezed. The metal resisted. Her arms shook with the effort. Then the lock broke. The sound was sharp and clean, and the chains fell away from Bear's wrists and clattered to the ground in a heap. His arms dropped into his lap like dead weight. He did not wake up. It took them 20 minutes to rouse him enough to move. Opal held the coffee to his lips while Willa patted his face and called his name with patient insistence. When his eyes finally opened, they were glassy and confused, the eyes of a man looking up from a great depth. "Come on," Soldier Opal said. "On your feet. We are not leaving you here." They got him up. It was an operation that should have been impossible. Two people, one elderly and one the size of a fourth grader, hauling a man who weighed 240 pounds to his feet and keeping him there. But they managed it. Bear leaned on Opal's shoulder and Willa walked ahead, clearing branches, and together they made their way out of the hollow and through the woods and down the back road to the alley behind Opal's store. The stockroom was small and cluttered, lined with shelves of inventory and stacked cases of canned goods. But it was dry and warm, and Opal had cleared a space in the back corner where a cot could fit, and she had laid blankets over it and set a kerosene heater nearby. They laid Bear down on the cot. He was shivering despite the fever, his massive body seeming suddenly small and fragile under the wool blankets. Willa tucked the edges around him the way Jolene tucked her in at night, carefully, thoroughly, with the serious attention of someone performing a ritual that matters. His hand came up and caught hers. "The letter," he said, his voice barely there. "The letter is still in the hollow. Under the roots. I hid it when I heard the chains breaking. I thought they had come back." Willa squeezed his fingers. "I will get it, I promise." She went back alone while Opal stayed with Bear. The fog had burned off by then, and the forest was sharp and clear. She found the hollow, found the gnarled roots at the base of the great oak, and found the envelope wedged into a gap, protected from the rain by a shelf of bark. She pulled it out and held it to her chest and carried it back like a treasure. When she returned, Opal was on the phone speaking in low, urgent tones to Doc Weaver, town's veterinarian. He was not a people doctor, but he was the closest thing to a medical professional that they could trust to keep his mouth shut. Opal had known him for 30 years and held enough of his secrets to ensure his cooperation. Willa placed the envelope in Bear's hand. His fingers closed around it automatically, even in his fevered sleep, and something in his face relaxed. It was past noon when Jolene found them. She came through the front door of the store like a storm front rolling in from the west. Her face was white, her eyes were wild, and her hands were shaking. She had woken to find Willa's bed empty and her backpack gone, and for 4 hours she had been searching, calling, driving the roads around Cedar Hollow with her phone pressed to her ear and her heart in her throat. "Willa Mae Crawford." Jolene's voice cut through the store like a blade. "You come out here right now." Willa emerged from the stockroom. Her face was calm, but her eyes were cautious. Before Willa could speak, Jolene saw the stockroom behind her. The cot, the blankets, the massive, unconscious man lying beneath them. Jolene went very still. "What have you done?" she whispered. "He was dying, Mama." Willa's voice did not waver. "He was chained to that tree, and he was dying. His wrists were infected, and he had a knife wound on his side that was turning poisonous. And if we did not move him, he would have died alone in those woods, and nobody would have even known." Jolene pushed past Willa into the stockroom. She stood over Bear, looking down at him. Fear was in her expression. Anger, too. But there was something else. Something complicated and unwilling that fought against the simpler emotions. "He is burning up," Jolene said. And the fact that her first words were clinical rather than furious told Willa everything she needed to know. Opal appeared in the doorway. "Doc Weaver is coming. He will be discreet." Jolene spun on the old woman. "You helped her do this. You helped my 7-year-old daughter drag a criminal through the woods. I helped your 7-year-old daughter save a man's life. There is a difference. There is no difference. He is Hell's Angels, Jolene. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand what it meant," Opal said. "I also understand what it could mean. Those are two different things." Bear chose that moment to stir. His eyes opened, unfocused and fever bright, and they landed on Jolene. He tried to sit up, and the effort nearly broke him. He got halfway before his arms gave out, and he fell back against the cot, gasping, his hand pressing against the wound on his side. "You must be Willa's mother," he said, and His voice was barely audible. I am sorry. I told her not to come back. I told her it was dangerous. She does not listen well. Despite everything, Jolene felt the corner of her mouth twitch. No, she said. She does not. Ma'am Bear continued, and the formality seemed almost absurd given his condition. You have every right to be angry, every right to call the sheriff and have me removed. I am not going to tell you that I am a good man because I have not been a good man for most of my life. But I need you to know something. He paused, and the effort of speaking seemed to drain him. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I was 22 when I went over and 26 when I came back. When I came home, things were not right. In my head, I could not sleep without seeing things, could not hear a car backfire without hitting the ground, could not sit in a room with the lights off without feeling like the walls were closing in. Jolene's face changed, a slight softening around the eyes. I went to the V. A Bear continued. They put me on a waiting list. 6 months. I did not make it 6 months. Lost my apartment, lost my truck, lost the last friend I had who was willing to put up with me. I was sleeping under an overpass in Roanoke when the Hells Angels found me. He looked directly at Jolene, and there was no self-pity in his gaze, just the plain, unvarnished truth. They gave me a bed and a meal, and people who did not look at me like I was something broken that needed to be swept off the sidewalk. That was enough. In the state I was in, that was enough. And by the time I realized what I had traded for it, I was in too deep to get out. He lifted the envelope slightly. 6 months ago, I got a letter from a woman I knew before the war. She told me I have a daughter, 8 years old. She thought I should know. She said the girl had been asking about her father. Bear's voice broke. That is why I left the gang. That is why they did what they did. Not because I betrayed them, because I wanted to be someone my daughter would not be ashamed of. And that was something they could not allow. The stockroom was very quiet. The kerosene heater hissed softly. Jolene looked at Willa, looked at Opal, looked back at Bear. My father was in Vietnam, Jolene said quietly. When he came home, he was different. Mama said he was never the same. He drank himself to death by the time I was 12. I am sorry to hear that, ma'am. Jolene was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight and controlled. The voice of a woman making a decision against her better judgment. Doc Weaver treats the wound and the infection. Willa does not come here alone ever again. And the moment he is well enough to move, we figure out something permanent. Those are my conditions. Opal nodded. Reasonable. Jolene turned to Willa. You scared me to death today, she whispered. I know, Mama. Willa took her mother's hand. I am sorry for the scared part, but I am not sorry for the rest. Sunday arrived with the particular quality of light that October brings to the Blue Ridge. A clarity so sharp it felt like the world had been rinsed clean overnight. Every edge defined, every color saturated. The Cedar Hollow Community Church sat on a small rise at the east end of Main Street, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple that had been pointing at the same patch of sky since 1923. Next to it stood the town hall where Sheriff Harlan had called a second meeting. Word had gotten out that the man from the woods was no longer in the woods, that he was being sheltered somewhere in town. The fear that had been simmering came to a full rolling boil. By 10 o'clock Sunday morning, every seat in the town hall was taken and people stood 3 deep along the back wall. Sheriff Harlan stood at the front. I will be direct, he said. The individual who was found in the woods last week has been moved into town. He is currently being sheltered by a member of this community. His eyes moved to Opal. This is not a situation I take lightly. The murmur that went through the room was like wind through dry grass. This man Harlan continued as Hank Maddox, street name Bear. He has been a member of the Hells Angels for approximately 15 years. His record includes assault, robbery, and conspiracy. He is by any legal and moral standard a dangerous individual. Pete Dawson stood up. Sheriff, what are we going to do about this? My kids play in those woods. He is not out there anymore, Harlan said evenly. He is right here, among us. The debate erupted. Bill Cooper pointed toward Opal. She brought him into town. She made this our problem. He is not being harbored, Opal replied from her seat. He is being treated for injuries. There is a difference. The difference does not matter to me when my family is at risk, said Karen Page. Then Pastor Amos stood up. He was 65 years old with a face like carved walnut and hands that had performed baptisms and dug graves and built the wheelchair ramp at the church entrance, one plank at a time. He did not speak loudly, but when he spoke, people listened. I would like to say something, he said, and the room quieted by degrees. I have been listening to you all talk about this man, about the danger he represents. And I understand that fear, but I would like to remind you of something. This church has a sign out front. It has had the same sign for 30 years. It says all are welcome. Now, either those words mean something or they do not. Either we believe that people can be redeemed or we do not. And if we do not, then that sign is just paint on wood, and this town is just buildings, and we are just people who talk about goodness, but do not practice it when the cost is real. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward. With all due respect, Pastor, this is not a sermon. This is a public safety issue. That is when Willa stood up on her chair. She did it the way she did everything, without hesitation, without drama. One moment she was sitting, and the next she was standing on the wooden seat, her sneakers leaving dusty prints on the surface. The room turned to look at her. "Mr. Bear's not bad," she said. Her voice was high and certain, cutting through the heavy adult air like sunlight through storm clouds. "He is wet and sorry and just wants to be good now. He has a daughter he has never met, and he left the bad people so he could find her. He did not do anything to us. He just wants a chance." She paused. "Why will you not let him have a chance?" The question hung in the air, simple as breathing, impossible to answer. Then Opal stood. She stood slowly the way a woman stands who has been carrying a secret for a long time and has finally decided to set it down. Her face was composed, but Willa could see the cost of what she was about to do, written in the fine lines around her eyes. "I need to tell you something," Opal said. "Something I should have told this town a long time ago." The room went very still. "My husband, Thomas Mackey, was the finest man most of you ever knew. He built your shelves and fixed your plumbing and brought soup when you were sick and never asked for anything in return." Her voice was steady, but her hands clasped in front of her were trembling. "He was also a Hell's Angel." The collective intake of breath sounded like a wave hitting rocks. Heads snapped toward Opal. Mouths fell open. Sheriff Harlan's hand went slack at his side. 35 years ago, Opal continued, Thomas Mackey was a 28-year-old man with a different name and a record that would make most of you lock your doors. He was running with the same kind of people that you are all so afraid of right now, doing the same kind of things. She looked around the room and her gaze was unflinching. And then he decided to change. He left. He came here. He started over with nothing but the clothes on his back and the determination to be someone different. Nobody in Cedar Hollow knew where he came from. Nobody asked. They just saw a man who worked hard and treated people right, and they accepted him. Opal's voice developed the slightest crack. If someone in some other town had said what you are all saying now, if they had said that men like that cannot change, that criminals do not deserve second chances, that the only answer is to drive them out, then Thomas Mackey would never have existed, and this town would have lost the best man it ever had. She sat down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Willa had ever heard. It was the silence of an entire community re-examining everything it thought it knew. Thomas Mackey, the man who had organized the 4th of July picnic for 20 years. The man who had rebuilt the church steps after the flood. The man whose name was on the plaque at the community garden. A Hell's Angel. The meeting ended without resolution. People filed out into the bright October sunlight, talking in low voices, their faces marked with confusion that comes when a firmly held belief encounters an inconvenient truth. Willa walked out between Jolene and Opal, one hand in each of theirs. Behind them, Sheriff Harlan watched from the doorway. His hand went to his shirt pocket where the outline of a folded letter was just visible beneath the fabric. He touched it once lightly, then he turned and went back inside. That night, the world changed. It happened at 9:47 in the evening. The town had gone quiet the way small towns do on Sunday nights. Porch lights glowed yellow through the darkness. A dog barked somewhere on Cedar Ridge. The autumn wind moved through the empty streets. Then the sound came. It started as a low rumble on the edge of hearing, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest before you hear with your ears. It grew quickly, building from a murmur to a roar to a thundering, earth-shaking wall of noise that rattled windows and set dogs howling and brought people stumbling out of their beds to press their faces against cold glass. 12 motorcycles. They came down Route 12 in a tight formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of something predatory. The engines were enormous, tuned to a pitch that turned the air itself into a weapon. They rode through the center of Cedar Hollow without stopping, past the diner and the hardware store, and the church with its sign that said, "All are welcome," past Opal's general store where a light burned in the back room, past Jolene's house where Willa stood at her window with her hands pressed flat against the glass and her eyes wide in the darkness. At the head of the formation rode a man who seemed larger than the others. Not physically, though he was tall and broad, but in presence, in the way the air moved around him. Colt. He wore no helmet. His face was bare to the wind, and even at speed, even in the dim wash of streetlights, the faces watching from behind curtains could see enough to feel their stomachs tighten. It was the face of a man who had lived entirely by his own rules for so long that the rules of ordinary society had become invisible to him. Not cruel exactly, something worse than cruel, indifferent. Sheriff Harlan was standing on the sidewalk in front of his office before the motorcycles had finished their pass through town. The motorcycles circled back. They pulled into the parking lot of Nell's Diner with synchronized precision, killed their engines simultaneously, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the noise had been. Colt dismounted. He took his time about it, pulled off his leather gloves one finger at a time, and tucked them into his belt. Then he looked at Sheriff Harlan. "Evening, Sheriff." His voice carried across the empty street, smooth and quiet and controlled. "Nice little town you have here." Colt continued, looking around with an appraising eye. "Peaceful, clean, the kind of place where people feel safe." "State your business," Harlan said. Colt reached into his jacket and pulled out a cigarette. He lit it slowly, took a long drag. The orange glow illuminated his face from below. "Looking for an old friend," Colt said, exhaling smoke. "Big man, lots of ink. Goes by Bear. Word has reached us that he has been enjoying your hospitality." He took another drag. "We would like him back. This individual is not in my custody." Colt smiled. It was the kind of smile that contains no humor whatsoever. "Did not say he was sheriff. Said he was enjoying your hospitality. Different thing." He dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Here is how this works. You have 24 hours. Find him and bring him to us, or we find him ourselves. And if we find him ourselves," he paused and looked around at the quiet houses and the dark storefronts. "Well, we tend to make a mess when we have to do things the hard way." He remounted his bike. 24 hours, Colt repeated. Then he kicked his engine to life, and the formation roared out of town, heading north on Route 12 toward the campground at Miller's Creek. The sound of the engines faded slowly, absorbed by the mountains and the forest. Willa pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her bedroom window. Behind her, she could hear Jolene on the phone, her voice urgent and low. 24 hours. And somewhere in a tent at Miller's Creek, a man who had not felt anything in years was sitting alone in the dark, thinking about nothing at all, because thinking was something he had stopped doing a long time ago, and the emptiness that had replaced it was the only thing that kept him upright. Monday morning. The 24 hours were nearly gone. Cedar Hollow moved through its routines with the stiff mechanical quality of people going through motions they no longer believe in. Shops opened at their usual times. Coffee was poured at Nell's Diner. Children were sent to school, though fewer than usual. Willa did not go to school. She told Jolene she had a stomachache, which was not entirely untrue. Her stomach had been in knots since dawn. Jolene, who was already late for an emergency meeting at the town hall that Sheriff Harlan had called for all concerned citizens, accepted the excuse with an absent-minded hand on Willa's forehead and a directive to stay in bed and keep the doors locked. "I will be back in 2 hours," Jolene said, grabbing her keys. "Opal is opening the store late, so she can be at the meeting too. Do not leave this house, Willa. I mean it." Willa stayed in bed for exactly 12 minutes, long enough for the sound of her mother's truck to fade down the road. Then she got up. She put on her shoes. She filled her backpack with a bottle of water and a granola bar, and after a moment's thought, the small compass her father had given her for her 5th birthday, the last gift before he disappeared. She left through the back door. She did not cross her fingers behind her back this time. There was no promise to break. Only a thing that needed to be done. Miller's Creek Campground was a 1.5 miles north of town up Route 12, and then a 1/4 mile down a dirt road that wound through scrubby, second-growth timber to a clearing by the creek. In summer, it was popular with families. In October, it was usually empty. Today, it was not empty. Willa heard them before she saw them. Not the engines this time, but voices. Low male voices and the clinking of bottles. She moved off the road and into the trees, picking her way through the underbrush with the practiced silence of someone who has spent most of her short life moving through woods. She found them in the main clearing. 12 motorcycles arranged in a neat row, a cluster of tents, a fire pit with embers still glowing, men in leather sitting on logs and leaning against bikes. And in the center of it all, sitting alone at a picnic table with a cup of coffee and a stillness that set him apart from the rest, was Colt. He was different up close. Older. The lines in his face were deep and numerous, carved by decades of weather and violence. His hair was dark and long, pulled back in a tail, and his hands wrapped around the coffee cup were scarred across the knuckles in ways that told stories Willa did not want to hear. But his eyes, Willa noticed his eyes. They were not the eyes of the monster she had expected. They were tired, deeply, profoundly tired. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. Willa stepped out of the trees. The reaction was immediate. Two men jerked upright, reaching for their belts. A third shouted a warning. Within seconds, every person in the clearing was on their feet and looking at the small girl with the pink backpack who had appeared from the woods. Colt did not move. He sat at the picnic table with his coffee and looked at Willa over the rim of his cup. His expression did not change. Well, he said, this is new. One of the men moved toward Willa. Hey, kid, you need to get out of here. Willa stood her ground. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but her voice when it came was steady. I need to talk to him, she said, looking past the approaching man directly at Colt. About Mr. Bear. The clearing went silent. Colt set down his coffee cup. He looked at Willa for a long moment. Then he raised one hand, a small economical gesture, and the man who had been approaching stopped in his tracks and stepped back. Let her through, Colt said. Willa walked across the clearing. She could feel every eye on her. She walked past the motorcycles and the tents and the dead fire pit and stopped at the edge of the picnic table directly across from Colt. She was so small. Standing there with her pink backpack and her crooked ponytail, she looked like a creature from a different world entirely. Colt studied her. His face remained expressionless, but something moved behind his eyes. You are the kid, he said, the one who found Bear in the woods. Yes, sir. My name is Willa. Sit down, Willa. She sat across from him. Up close, she could see a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, thin and white against his weathered skin. You have got some nerve, kid, Colt said. Coming into our camp like this. I had to, because nobody else will. Nobody else will what? Tell you the truth about Mr. Bear. A thin smile crossed Colt's face. And what truth is that? That he is a good person who did bad things and wants to stop. That he is sorry. That he has a daughter he has never met. And all he wants in the world is to find her and tell her he is sorry and be her father. Willa pulled the straps of her backpack tighter. He is not trying to hurt you or your friends. He just wants to leave. And if you take him back, you are not punishing a traitor. You are killing a father. The silence stretched. Colt's eyes had not left Willa's face. You are a brave kid, Colt said finally. Stupid maybe, but brave. He picked up his coffee cup and took a long, slow drink. When he set it down, his eyes went to the tree line, and for a moment he seemed to be looking at something very far away. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its performance. 24 hours, he said. The clock is still running. He stood up from the table, but as he turned to walk toward his tent, Willa called out to him. Mr. Colt, do you have children? The question hit him between the shoulder blades like a thrown stone. Willa saw it in the way his back went rigid, in the way his hands clenched once and then slowly opened, in the way his head dropped forward just slightly. He did not answer. He walked to his tent and disappeared inside, and the flap closed behind him with a soft sound that was somehow louder than any engine. Willa sat at the picnic table for a moment longer. Then she stood up, shouldered her backpack, and walked back through the clearing toward the trees. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. At the edge of the tree line, she paused and looked back. Colt's tent was still. The flap did not move. But inside, if Willa had been able to see through the canvas, she would have found a man sitting on the edge of a cot with his head in his hands. And in his hand, pulled from a hidden pocket in the lining of his jacket, a photograph so worn that the image had almost faded to nothing. A little girl, dark hair, bright eyes, 7 years old, laughing at something the camera could not see. Jolene found Willa on the road back to town. She was driving the truck, and she pulled over so sharply that gravel sprayed across the shoulder. She was out of the cab before the engine stopped rocking, and she crossed the distance between them and pulled Willa into a hug that was equal parts fury and relief. What did you do? Jolene whispered into Willa's hair. What did you do, baby? I talked to him, Mama. I talked to the man in charge. I told him the truth about Mr. Bear. Jolene pulled back and held Willa at arm's length. Her face was a wreck of emotion. You walked into their camp, alone. You are 7 years old. I know how old I am, Mama. Jolene stared at her daughter, at this small, impossible, infuriating, extraordinary person she had somehow made, and she felt something break open inside of her that she had been holding shut for a very long time. She pulled Willa close again and held her there on the side of the road, with the mountains rising up around them and the October wind moving through the trees, and she cried. Not the quiet, private crying she did at night, real crying. The kind that comes from a place where love and fear live so close together that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," Jolene said, "and you are grounded for the rest of your natural life." Willa nodded against her mother's chest. "That is fair," she said. They drove back to Cedar Hollow in silence. The afternoon light was golden on the mountains, and the trees along Route 12 blazed with color, and the world was beautiful in the way that the world is always beautiful when you are not sure what is going to happen next. Monday evening. The 24 hours expired at 9:47. Cedar Hollow knew it. Every person in every house on every street knew it the way animals know when a storm is close. Not through calculation or clocks, but through something older. A tightening of the air, a change in pressure. At Opal's general store, the light in the stockroom still burned. Bear was sitting up on the cot. The fever had broken that morning thanks to the antibiotics Doc Weaver had provided, and though he was still weak, still hollowed out, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Clarity. The terrible, clean clarity of a man who knows exactly what he has to do and exactly what it will cost. Willa sat on an overturned crate beside the cot. She had refused to leave. Jolene stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Opal moved quietly between the shelves. Bear looked at the three of them. These women who had saved his life. This child who had walked into a den of wolves on his behalf. "I have to go out there," Bear said. The words fell into the room like stones into a well. Jolene's head went up. Opal's hands went still. Willa's fingers tightened on her backpack straps. "No," Jolene said. "Absolutely not. You can barely stand." "That is not the point, ma'am." Bear swung his legs off the cot and sat on the edge. "The point is that Colt gave this town 24 hours, and if I am not out there when those hours are up, he will come in here and get me. And he will not be gentle about it. Not with the town, not with any of you." He looked at Willa. "Especially not with you, little girl. He knows you came to the camp. If I hide in this stockroom and let him come looking, you become a target. All of you do. I will not let that happen." Willa slid off her crate and stood in front of him. "Then I am going with you." "No," Bear's voice was firm. "Yes," Willa's voice was firmer. Jolene stepped forward. "Nobody is going anywhere. We call the state police." Opal spoke from the shelves. "The state police are 40 minutes away, Jolene. Those men are a mile and a half up the road. By the time anyone gets here, it will be over one way or another." The room absorbed this truth. Bear reached for the crumpled envelope on the cot beside him. He held it in both hands, looking down at it the way a man looks at a compass when he is lost. He held it out to Willa. "If something happens to me tonight," he said, "I need you to send this letter. The address is on the front. Her name is Lily. She is in Knoxville, Tennessee. She has never heard from me, but this letter tells her everything she needs to know." Willa took the envelope with both hands. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said, "but I will keep it safe." Bear nodded, then he stood up. The room seemed to contract around him. He was massive, even diminished, even wearing a borrowed flannel shirt and work boots from Opal's stockroom. For a moment, standing there with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, he looked like what he had been before everything went wrong. A Marine. He walked toward the door. Jolene moved to block him. "Please," she said. Her voice broke. Bear looked down at her. "Your daughter is the reason I am alive. She gave me something nobody has given me in 20 years. She gave me a reason to try." He put his hand on the doorframe. "I'm going to try now, ma'am." He opened the door and stepped out into the night. Main Street was empty. The storefronts were dark. The wind had picked up since sundown, and it moved through the town with a low, steady moan. Bear walked down the center of the street. His boots struck the pavement with a measured rhythm. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, though he was, but because he wanted the sound to carry. He had gone half a block when he heard the screen door. He turned. Willa was standing on the sidewalk in front of Opal's store, her backpack on the envelope visible in her hand. Behind her, Jolene stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth and tears on her face. Behind Jolene, Opal watched with an expression that was as close to open emotion as anyone had ever seen on her face. Bear shook his head. "Go back inside, Willa." "No, sir," Willa said. And she walked out into the street and stood beside him. Bear closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. A resignation that was also a kind of peace. The peace of a man who realizes that he cannot control what the people he cares about choose to do. Jolene was next. She came off the sidewalk and crossed to where they stood, and she took Willa's free hand, and she looked up at Bear with wet eyes and a jaw set like concrete. "If my daughter is going," Jolene said, "then I am going." Opal locked the store door behind her. She walked to the group and stood beside Jolene, and she said nothing because Opal had always believed that presence was more eloquent than words. They walked together down Main Street. 4 people: an enormous battered ex-convict in a borrowed shirt, a 7-year-old girl with a pink backpack, a young mother who had spent her life being afraid, an old woman who had spent her life being closed. They were halfway to the town square when the first door opened. It was Pastor Amos. He came out of the parsonage beside the church still wearing his house slippers and a cardigan buttoned wrong, and he crossed the street and fell into step beside Opal without a word. The next door was Pete Dawson's, the man who had stood up at the town meeting and demanded action. He came out with his wife and stood on his porch and watched the group pass, and something moved across his face, and then he came down the steps and joined them. Then Karen Page, then Bill Cooper and his wife, then old Mrs. Wheaton from the end of the block, who was 83 years old and walked with a cane and had not left her house after dark in 5 years. She came down her front walk in her bathrobe and joined the group. More doors opened. More people came out. Not everyone, not the whole town, but enough. Enough to fill the street with footsteps. Enough to make the group swell from 4 to 10 to 20 to something approaching 40. Some carried flashlights. Some carried nothing. Old Dub Patterson carried a thermos of coffee because he believed that most problems could be improved by a hot cup of something. They reached the town square. The flagpole stood at the center, the flag moving in the wind. The benches were arranged around the base of the war memorial, a modest granite column with names carved into its faces. Names of boys from Cedar Hollow who had gone to war and not come back. Bear saw his own war's name among them: Afghanistan, and below that Korea, World War II, Vietnam, generations of sons who had answered a call and paid a price. The group arranged itself in the square. Some sat on the benches, some stood. Willa stood at the base of the memorial with Bear on one side and Jolene on the other, and her hand never left Bear's. Then the sound came, distant at first, a low building thunder. It grew and the ground seemed to tremble with it. 12 headlights appeared on Route 12. They came down the road and turned onto Main Street and filled the town with light and noise and the smell of exhaust. The people in the square drew closer together without being told to. The motorcycles pulled into the square and fanned out in a semicircle. Their headlights pinned the townspeople in harsh white light, casting long shadows behind them. One by one, the engines died. Colt dismounted. He stood in front of his bike and looked at the scene before him. The cluster of townspeople, the old woman and the young mother and the pastor in his slippers, the children and the retired men and the shopkeepers. And in the center of it all, Bear. And beside Bear, her hand in his, the little girl with the pink backpack. Colt's eyes went to Willa first. They stayed there. Then they moved to Bear. "Quite a welcome party, Grizz," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square. "You have been busy." Bear stepped forward, one step, just enough to create space between himself and the people behind him. He released Willa's hand gently. "I am not going back, Colt." The words carried no anger, no defiance. They were a statement of fact. Colt tilted his head. Behind him, the gang members shifted. Leather creaked. "You know the rules, Bear. Same rules you swore to, same rules you enforced on others. You do not get to walk away." "I know the rules," Bear said. "I wrote some of them, enforced most of them. I know exactly what I am asking you to do by letting me go." His hands hung at his sides, open, empty. "I'm asking you anyway. Why should I? Because every day you live by those rules is a day you spend dying. I know, Colt. I know because I lived it. 15 years of waking up angry and going to sleep angry and filling the hours in between with enough noise and violence to keep from hearing the one voice I did not want to hear." "What voice is that?" "My own." Bear took another step forward. "The voice that said, 'This is wrong.' That said, I was built for something better than this. That said, somewhere out there is a little girl who shares my blood and has never heard her father's voice, and every day I spend in this life is a day stolen from her." The square was completely silent. "You can take me back," Bear continued. "You can do what the rules say, and nothing will change. The club will go on. The violence will go on. And 10 years from now, somebody else will be standing where I am standing, asking the same thing I am asking." He spread his hands. "Or you can do something else, something harder. You can let me go. And maybe that does not change the world. But it will mean that one time in one place, mercy was stronger than the rules." Colt stood very still. His face was unreadable. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward. He came from the edge of the group. He walked past the townspeople and past Bear and stopped in the open space between the two sides. His hand went to his shirt pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even in the harsh light of the motorcycle headlamps, the age and wear of it were visible. "I want to read you something," Harlan said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tremor that came from the effort of opening a door that has been locked for a very long time. He unfolded the letter. "This was written by my brother," Harlan said. His name was Levi. He was 31 years old. He was in prison for the third time. He had done bad things, and I had given up on him, turned my back, stopped taking his calls. Harlan's voice cracked. "This is the last thing he ever wrote to me. He died 2 weeks later, alone, in a cell, without a single person in the world who believed he could be different." He held the letter up and read it aloud. "Cole, I know you gave up on me. I understand why. But I want you to know I am trying. I am really trying this time. I just need one person to believe I can change. Just one person to give me a chance. If that person cannot be you, then I guess it cannot be anyone. I love you, brother. I am sorry for everything." Harlan folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. His eyes were wet, but he did not wipe them. "I did not answer that letter," Harlan said. "I did not go to see him. I did not give him the one thing he asked for. And he died." He turned to face Bear. "I am not going to make that mistake again. Not tonight. Not with this man. Whatever he has done, he is standing here asking for a chance to be different. And I am going to be the person who gives it to him. Because I should have been that person for Levi, and I was not, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life." He stepped to Bear's side and turned to face Colt. The square held its breath. Then Willa stepped forward. She walked out from behind Bear past Harlan into the open space between the two groups. She was so small against the backdrop of motorcycles and headlights that she looked like something from a different story entirely. She walked directly to Colt and stopped in front of him. She had to tilt her head all the way back to see his face. He was tall, and the angle of the headlights behind him turned his features into sharp shadows. Willa reached into the pocket of her jacket. She pulled something out and held it up to him. The crumpled envelope. Bear's letter to his daughter. "Mr. Bear wrote this for his little girl," Willa said. "She is 8 years old. He has never met her. He does not know what her voice sounds like or what makes her laugh or whether she likes peanut butter sandwiches. He does not know any of those things because he was with you instead of with her." Her eyes did not drop. She held the letter up the way a torch is held. "If you take him back, she will never get this letter. She will grow up without a father. She will always wonder why he did not come for her. And one day she will stop wondering and she will just be angry, and the anger will turn into something hard, and she will spend her whole life carrying it around." Willa lowered the letter slightly. "Do you have children, Mr. Colt?" The silence lasted a long time. Long enough for the wind to change direction. Long enough for a cloud to cross the moon and pass on. Long enough for every person in the square to understand that the outcome of this night was being decided not by threats or force, but by whatever was happening behind the eyes of the man standing in front of a 7-year-old girl. Colt reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate, and every person in the square tensed. But what Colt pulled out was not a weapon. It was a photograph, small, wallet-sized, so old and handled that the image had faded to a pale ghost of itself. A little girl with dark hair and bright eyes and a smile that split her face wide open. 7 or 8 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. Colt held the photograph and looked at it. His thumb moved across the surface, a small unconscious gesture. "Her name is Grace," Colt said. His voice was different. The smooth control was gone. The performance was gone. What was left was raw and rough and human. "She is 23 now. Or she was last I knew. She left when she was 16. Could not stand what her father was. Told me she wished I was dead. Walked out the door and never came back." The words fell into the square like drops of water into an empty well. "I looked for her for a while. Then I stopped. Told myself she did not want to be found. Told myself it was better for her if she did not have a father at all than if she had a father like me." He looked at the photograph for another long moment. Then he looked at Willa. Colt held the photograph out to her. "If you ever find her," he said, and his voice cracked on the word the way a frozen river cracks in spring. "If you ever meet a girl named Grace who does not want to talk about her father, tell her that her father is sorry, that he wishes he had been the kind of man whose daughter did not have to run away." Willa took the photograph with both hands. She held it against her chest right next to Bear's letter. "I will keep it safe," she said. Colt looked at her, then he looked at Bear. Then he looked at the townspeople clustered behind Bear, all those faces scared and brave and ordinary. He looked for a long time. Then he turned to his men. His face was hard again, the mask back in place. But something behind it had shifted. "Mount up," Colt said. One of the men stepped forward. "Colt, we are not just leaving. The rules say he." I said, "Mount up." Colt did not raise his voice, but the quality of command in those 3 words was absolute. The man hesitated, then he turned and walked to his bike. One by one, the others followed. Engine started. Headlights swung away from the square. Colt was the last to mount. He sat on his bike and looked at Willow one final time. "Take care of Bear, kid," he said quietly, "and take care of that photograph." Then he kicked his engine to life, and the formation pulled out of the square and onto Main Street and north on Route 12, and the sound of their engines rolled through the valley and off the mountains and faded slowly into the distance until it was gone. Cedar Hollow stood in the aftermath. For a long time, nobody moved. People looked at each other with the dazed, slightly disbelieving expressions of survivors. Bear was the first to move. His legs gave out. The adrenaline drained away all at once, and he dropped to his knees on the pavement. His head dropped forward, and his shoulders began to shake, and the sound that came from him was not crying exactly. It was something deeper, the sound of a man feeling the full weight of his own survival for the first time. Willa knelt beside him. She put one hand on his arm right over the dragon tattoo that wrapped around his forearm. "It is okay, Mr. Bear," she said. "It is over." Jolene came next. She knelt on his other side and placed her hand on his shoulder. Then Opal, standing behind them, her hand on Willa's back. Then Pastor Amos, his lips moving in a prayer that was more breath than words. Then Sheriff Harlan, who stood a few feet away, with his hat in his hands and his brother's letter in his pocket. Then the others. One by one, the people of Cedar Hollow gathered around Bear in the town square, and the circle they formed was not perfect and not complete, but it was enough. Pete Dawson cleared his throat. "Got a spare room above the garage," he said. "It is not much. Kind of dusty, but it has a bed and a heater, and the roof does not leak too bad." "You will need clothes," said Sarah Miller from the general store. "Doc Weaver can check those wounds properly now," Opal added. Mrs. Wheaton produced from the pocket of her bathrobe a small foil-wrapped package. "Banana bread," she said. "I bake when I am nervous." "I have been very nervous this week." Bear looked at the banana bread, at the faces around him, at the hands being offered and the doors being opened by people who had been afraid of him a week ago. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of those 2 words carried more weight than any speech could have. 3 months later, the first snow came to the Blue Ridge. It arrived overnight, quiet and steady, draping the mountains in white and turning Cedar Hollow into something from a postcard. Smoke rose from chimneys, icicles hung from eaves. The creek froze at its edges but kept running in the center. Bear lived above Pete Dawson's garage. The room was small and spare, with a single window that looked out over the rooftops toward the mountains. He had furnished it himself, mostly with things people had given him. A quilt from Mrs. Wheaton, a rocking chair from Bill Cooper's wife, a bookshelf that Pastor Amos had helped him build one Saturday afternoon. He worked. That was the foundation of everything. He fixed Mrs. Wheaton's porch railing and replaced the rotted steps at the church and rebuilt the engine on Pete Dawson's delivery truck. He helped Opal reorganize the stockroom, and she paid him in coffee and conversation. Sheriff Harlan came by the garage every morning. Not officially. He came as Cole Harlan, a 60-year-old man with a dead brother and a need to understand what redemption looks like in practice. He brought coffee. They sat on the bench outside the garage and watched the town wake up. "You ever stop thinking about it?" Harlan asked one morning, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "The things you did." Bear wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the mountains. "No," he said, "but it changes. At first, it is all you can hear, like static on a radio all day, all night, so loud you cannot think. Then slowly, if you are lucky, if you do the work, other sounds come in. The sound of a hammer hitting a nail straight. The sound of someone saying thank you and meaning it. The sound of a kid laughing at something she finds funny." He took a drink of his coffee. "The static does not go away, but it gets quieter, and the other sounds get louder. And one day you realize you spent a whole afternoon without hearing it at all." Harlan nodded. He pulled his brother's letter from his pocket, held it for a moment, put it back. "I started writing to him," Harlan said. "Letters I cannot send. To Levi, telling him what is happening here. What you are doing, what Willa did. Figured if I cannot give him the chance I should have given him, I can at least tell him about the one I gave someone else. Bear said nothing. He put his hand on Harlan's shoulder for a moment. Then they sat in silence and watched the snow fall and drank their coffee until it was gone. Willa visited every day after school. She came with her backpack, still the same faded pink one. The contents had evolved. She still carried a magnifying glass, but now she also carried books from the school library that she thought Bear might like, and drawings she had made in art class, and an increasingly detailed plan for a treehouse that she wanted Bear to help her build in the spring. She sat on the workbench in the garage while Bear repaired things and they talked. About everything and nothing. About the constellations she was learning in science class. About Bear's time in the Marines, the good parts. About the forest which they still visited together on weekends, Bear learning the names she had given to the trees. She never asked about the bad things. She did not need to. She understood that the bad things were part of him, the way rings are part of a tree, invisible from the outside but present in every fiber. She did not need to see the rings to know the tree. On a Tuesday in January, Bear received a phone call. He was in the garage sanding down a cabinet door he was refinishing for the church. His hands, calloused now from months of honest work, moved the sandpaper in smooth, even strokes. His phone buzzed on the workbench, an unknown number. Tennessee area code. His hands stopped moving. He stared at the phone for a long time. His heart began to pound with a force that made his vision blur. He knew who it was. He knew the way he had known on that first morning in the hollow that Willa was not going to run away. He picked up the phone. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. He pressed the green button and raised it to his ear, and for a moment he could not speak. His throat had closed. His eyes had filled. "Hello," a woman's voice, young, cautious. "Is this?" She paused. "Is this Hank?" "Yes," Bear whispered. "Yes, this is Hank." A long silence. The sound of breathing. Then very quietly, a voice that was neither the woman's nor a child's, but something in between. The voice of an 8-year-old girl who has just been handed a telephone and told that the person on the other end is her father. "Hi," one syllable, a single sound, the smallest word in the English language, and it broke Bear open like an axe splits wood, clean and sudden and all the way through. "Hi, baby girl," he said, and his voice was a ruin, a wreck, a shattered thing that was somehow also the truest sound he had ever made. "This is your dad. I am so sorry. I am so sorry it took me so long." Willa was coming up the stairs to the garage when she heard him. She stopped on the landing and listened, and she heard a man crying and laughing and saying the same words over and over into a telephone. "I am sorry. I love you. I am here. I am here. I am here." She sat down on the top step and hugged her backpack to her chest and smiled. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out two things. Bear's crumpled envelope, still sealed, that she would no longer need to mail, and a faded photograph of a dark-haired girl with bright eyes. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she turned it over. On the back, in small, careful letters, she wrote something, an address. Opal had helped her find it. It had taken weeks of quiet searching, phone calls made from the store's back office. Grace, an apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, 3 hours south. Willa tucked the photograph into an envelope she had already addressed and stamped. She would drop it in the mailbox on her way home. No note inside, just the photograph, and written on the back, the words Willa had promised to deliver. "Your father is sorry." Whether Grace would read it, whether she would believe it, whether she would ever speak to her father again, Willa did not know. Some letters get answered, some do not. Some arrive too late, and some arrive at exactly the right moment, and there is no way to know which kind yours will be until you send it. But Willa believed in sending them anyway. The afternoon sun came through the garage window and fell across the landing where she sat. Behind her, Bear's voice was soft now, asking questions, laughing at answers, learning the sound of his daughter's voice, the way a blind man learns the shape of a face. She left him to it. Some moments are private. Some doors once opened need to be walked through alone. She walked through Cedar Hollow in the late afternoon light. The snow had melted from the streets but still clung to the rooftops. She passed the diner where Nell waved from behind the counter. She passed the hardware store where Dub Patterson and the bench crew were arguing about something that did not matter and enjoying every minute of it. She passed the church with its sign that said "All are welcome," and the words meant something now that they had not meant before. She walked to the edge of town where the road turned to dirt and the dirt turned to trail, and the trail led into the forest. The trees were bare now, their branches dark against the winter sky, but Willa could see the buds already forming tiny and tight, waiting for spring. She followed the trail past the creek and through the hickory grove and up the slope to the hollow where the old oak stood. The great tree was still there. Of course it was. It had been there for hundreds of years and would be there for hundreds more. But something had changed. Where the chains had discarded the bark, new growth had already begun to fill in. Pale, fresh bark was covering the damage smooth and tender, the tree, healing itself the way trees do slowly and without complaint, turning wounds into rings that would become part of its story. And at the base of the tree, in the soft earth, between the roots, wildflowers grew. Willa had planted them in November, small bulbs pushed into the cold ground with her bare fingers, an act of faith in a season that showed no evidence of bloom. She had not told anyone. The flowers were crocuses, purple and white and gold, pushing up through the last of the snow with the stubborn, unreasonable optimism that is the particular genius of small things that refuse to give up. Willa sat down among them, her backpack in her lap. She closed her eyes and listened to the forest, the creek below, the wind above, the slow, patient creak of the oak branches, the whole world breathing. She thought about Bear on the phone with his daughter, learning to be a father one sentence at a time. She thought about Sheriff Harlan writing letters he could never send, finding peace in the trying. She thought about Opal, who had finally told the truth about the man she loved, and in doing so, had freed herself. She thought about Jolene, who had watched her daughter walk into the camp of a motorcycle gang and had found the strength to let her be brave. She thought about Colt, about the photograph of a laughing girl and the words "your father is sorry," and the envelope waiting for the mailbox on the corner of Main and Cedar. She thought about all of them, all these people whose lives had been changed by a decision she had made on a Monday morning in October. The decision to sit down instead of run. The decision to offer a sandwich instead of a scream. The decision to see a person where everyone else saw a threat. It had not been a brave decision at the time. It had just been the obvious one. The way breathing is obvious. The way kindness is obvious when you are 7 years old and have not yet learned all the reasons adults give themselves for withholding it. Willa opened her eyes. The sun was low, painting the bare trees in gold. She reached out and touched the bark of the old oak tree, felt the roughness of it under her fingers, felt the new growth covering the old wounds. Footsteps on the trail behind her. She turned. Bear stood at the top of the slope, looking down into the hollow. He was wearing the work jacket Pete Dawson had given him, and his hands were in his pockets, and his face was different than she had ever seen it. He was smiling. Not the small, broken smile he had given her on that second morning. This was a real smile, a smile that started somewhere deep inside and worked its way out through layers of scar tissue and regret until it reached the surface and transformed his entire face. He walked down the slope and sat beside her under the tree. Their tree. The place where everything had started and everything had changed. "She has my eyes," Bear said. His voice was thick with emotion but steady. "She likes horses and hates math, and her favorite color is yellow. She asked me if I was tall, and I said yes, and she said good because she wants to be tall too." He looked at Willa, and his eyes were not sad anymore. They were full. Full to overflowing with something that had no name but did not need one, because everyone who has ever felt it knows exactly what it is. "She said she wants to meet me," Bear whispered. "In the spring, her mother said she can come for a visit." Willa leaned against his shoulder. His arm came around her, careful and gentle. The light fell through the bare branches and touched them both. Behind them, the forest stretched to the mountains. Before them, the trail led back to town, back to the people who were learning day by day what it means to give someone a second chance. The crocuses swayed in the wind, purple and white and gold, the colors of bruises healing, the colors of dawn, the colors of things that grow in impossible places because they do not know that they are not supposed to. Willa tilted her head back and looked up through the branches at the sky. It was deepening from blue to violet, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "Are you happy, Mr. Bear?" she asked. Bear looked down at his hands. Hands that had held weapons and chains and a crumpled letter and a telephone through which he had heard his daughter's voice for the first time. Hands that were calloused now from building and fixing and making things right. "For the first time in my life," he said. The stars came out one by one, and the wind moved through the hollow, and the crocuses bent and straightened and bent again, and the ancient oak tree held them all in its shadow and its shelter the way it had held everything that had ever rested beneath it. Seasons of birth and death and change and stillness. Centuries of small creatures taking shelter from the rain. Generations of roots growing deeper and branches reaching higher and bark covering over the wounds that time and weather and the hands of men had carved into its skin. And now this, a man and a child, sitting together in the last light, not the end of anything, just the beginning.